Here are a few more examples on factoring in case you need it. And if you notice the three different expressions that I picked, they're all very similar. They all start with a 6x squared. They all end with a 4, but where they change up is the middle term and what's the sign on the 4. So by looking at these three different examples, I want to show you how you can deal with some of those negative signs that are popping up. Now, I still want to start the problem the same way. In every single one of these, I still want to multiply what's going to be the first coefficient and the last coefficient and start brainstorming my list. So I'm just going to do a big list since I know every single one of these. Oops, excuse me. Let me make sure I'm on the right tool. There we go. Every single one of these, I'm still multiplying the 6 and the 4 to look at my different factors. However, slight difference here. You'll notice the first two expressions have a positive 6 and a negative 4, whereas the second expression is positive 6 and positive 4. So actually, I need to do two different brainstormings. So our first brainstorming is what's going to happen when we have that negative 24. And so we want to look at all of our possible different combinations to get those middle terms set up when we add our factors together. And so let's see, both of our first expressions have a 5x. So we're trying to get a 5 difference between our terms. So we're going to do, let's see, we could do 2 times 12. But again, to get a negative, we'd have to do 1 negative and 1 positive. So we've got that combination. That's not going to get us to the 5. Let's see, we have 3 times 8. So negative 3 times 8, or 3 times a negative 8. And that's actually going to work for our first two expressions. We're looking for a difference of 5 between those functions. So let's go ahead and set up our box method for each one of these. So in our first one, again, first term in the first box, last term in the last box. And so for this one, let's call this number 1. So for number 1, to get that positive 5x in the middle, we actually want to have the negative 3 and positive 8. So this is for number 1. So I'm going to plug those in. It really doesn't matter which order you plug them into your box, to be honest. So it's all about making sure that you're getting that middle term set up properly. So then same thing we did before, we're looking for a GCF between each row and each column. So for our first, let's do our first row. So 6x squared and negative 3x. Again, they have a 3 in common and they have an x in common. Between 8x and negative 4, we've got a 4 in common. So then do our columns. So 6x squared and 8x, we have a 2x as a GCF. Negative 3x and negative 4, well, they're both negative, but that's really the only thing they have in common. So there's our negative 1. And we went ahead and factored out that negative with that second column. So that means our 3x and 4, that means we're going to have a plus in between those terms. Anytime you've already dealt with that negative sign, you've already factored it out somewhere, the other factor is going to be a positive. So our final factor on this, we're going to have a 3x plus 4 and a 2x minus 1. And again, if we wanted to go through and double check, we could distribute out to check that problem. Okay, number 2. So in number 2, our second example, we have the same factorings, but we have a different sign in the middle. Now we have a positive 5, a negative 5 instead of a positive 5. So for number 2, we're actually going to use the last one that we brainstormed, the 3 and the negative 8, because again, if I add those terms together, 3x plus a negative 8x gives me a negative 5. So my setup is going to be very similar. I'm still going to do the 6x and the negative 4 in the first and last box, but now I'm going to use a positive 3x and a negative 8x. And you'll notice the way I have it, I still have that negative sign in common between an entire row or an entire column. So I'm going to be able to factor out that negative just fine. So again, let's go rows and columns. Okay, so if I go across my rows, 6x, excuse me, that was a 6x squared. Let me fix that. There we go. So 6x squared and 3x, they have a 3x in common. Negative 8x and negative 4, well, now they have that negative 4 in common. And there's our negative sign factored out. So any other factor is always going to be positive. So the next one that we're matching up, 6x squared and negative 8x. Again, we already dealt with that negative. So we're just going to look at the 2x that's in common. And then 3x and negative 4. Again, we don't have a negative to factor out, and there's no common factor between 3 and 4. So that means I'm just going to use a 1. Again, 1 is your common factor if nothing else is in common between your terms. And so our factors are 3x minus 4 and 2x plus 1. And so you'll notice it's only a difference of switching where that negative sign was, and it totally changes the middle term. So then our third example, and I'm going to have to do a new brainstorming on this one. So because if I look at my terms in number 3, we have a 6 and a 4, but they're both positive. And we're trying to make that negative in that second term. So it's like the very first example that we looked at. So to make a 24, a positive 24 when we multiply, that means we're actually going to need to look at negative values to make that negative 11 in the middle, because negative times, just negative times a negative. Let me fix that. Go to eraser. There we go. Because a negative times a negative is always going to give us a positive. So I could take pairs of negative factors to make this work. So I need to make a negative 11. Thinking about what we factored out before for our 24, what do you think is going to work? If I use a negative 3 times a negative 8, well, negative 3 plus negative 8 is going to get me to that negative 11 in the middle. Again, all I'm doing is changing up the signs that I have to use. So let's draw our box and see where we're at. So here's our box. Again, first term, last term, and then we're filling in the other, so we would add to make the middle term. So negative 3 plus negative 8, so we're going to have a negative 3x and a negative 8x. And so this, we don't have the negative signs in common between one row or one column. So what's probably going to happen is we're going to have one negative sign in each one of our final factors. So let's see what happens. And again, we'll look at this the same way that you did in that second video example. So again, moving across our row first, we have a 6x squared and a negative 3x. Really, the only things they have in common is a 3x. 8x or negative 8x and 4, they do have a 4 in common. Okay, so then we have 6x squared and negative 8x if we're going up our column. Again, the only thing in common is a 2x. Negative 3x and 4, only thing in common is a 1. However, we need to look at, well, where are those negative signs going to end up? And again, because we didn't factor that out anywhere else, that means each one of these is going to have a negative. Each of our factors will have that negative sign in the middle. And so our factors end up as 3x minus 4 and 2x minus 1. And again, if you're unsure if this is a correct factoring, go ahead and multiply it out. So let's do that on this one. Let's go to light blue. So distribute out your 3x over both terms. So we're going to have a 6x squared and a negative 3x. Then distribute out your negative 4 to both terms. So that's a negative 8x and a plus 4, because negative 4 times negative 1. And then combine your middle terms, and you end up with a 6x squared minus 11x plus 4. So that means our factoring that we had was correct. Again, let me know if you have any extra questions. Otherwise, try out your factoring for the last set of examples. Again, you are provided with a chart that you can write in, but you don't need to put that in online. If you want to write that out on your own paper, you are more than welcome to do so.